Don't be a feminist, a letter to my daughter. Dear Valley, you're growing up, and before long you're going to hear about an idea called feminism. Most of those who talk about this idea will speak as if feminism is obviously true. They will speak as if feminism is entitled to your support, and they will speak as if you have to be evil to oppose feminism. As I write this, you're still too young to read it, but I want to get my thoughts down on paper now, so they're waiting for you when you're ready. As you've probably heard, Valley, I am one of feminism's opponents. And since I am your father, you know I'm not evil. Indeed, in at least one way, saintly. I never lie to you. Other adults often try to deceive you, allegedly for your own good. Your father, however, believes in telling you the truth, even when the truth is ugly or unpopular. You know all this from first-hand experience. However, you react to my critique of feminism. What follows is the literal truth, according to me. 1. Defining feminism. To start, what is feminism? Many casually define it as the view that men and women should be treated equally, or even the radical notion that women are people. Note. Or as this article in The Economist opens, to be a feminist is simply to believe that everybody should be treated equally regardless of sex. It means you think that there should be equality of the sexes economically, socially, politically, and personally. However, virtually all non-feminists in the United States believe exactly the same thing. In this careful 2016 survey, for example, only 33% of men said they were feminists. Yet 94% of men agreed that men and women should be social, political, and economic equals. So what? Well, the whole point of a definition is to distinguish one concept from all the others. Any sensible definition of feminism must therefore specify what feminists believe that non-feminists disbelieve. Defining feminism as the view that men and women should be treated equally makes about as much sense as defining feminism as the view that the sky is blue. Sure, feminists believe in the blueness of the sky, but who doesn't? What then is a reasonable definition? A definition that identifies the central point of contention between feminists and non-feminists. Something like this. Feminism is the view that society generally treats men more fairly than women. Note, a stickler could append, even though both genders ought to be treated equally. Wikipedia conventionally defines feminism as a range of socio-political movements and ideologies that aim to define and establish the political, economic, personal, and social equality of the sexes, but then more thoughtfully adds, feminism incorporates the position that societies prioritize the male point of view and that women are treated unjustly within those societies. Feminism, Wikipedia, May 12, 2022, Caplan, Bryan, Against Argumentative Definitions. Almost any self-identified feminist work you examine will heavily focus on society's alleged mistreatment of women relative to men. Some of the more readable works include The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan, Simone de Beauvoir, The Second Sex, Feminism is for Everyone by Bell Hooks, and Good and Mad by Rebecca Traister. What makes my definition so superior to the competition's? Just talk to self-identified feminists and non-feminists, and you'll see that my definition fits the common usage of the word. Ask any feminist if society generally treats men more fairly than women, and they'll confidently agree. If you push further and ask, doesn't society sometimes treat men unfairly too? They'll respond along the lines of, sure, but the point is that women endure far more unfairness than men. In contrast, if you ask non-feminists if society generally treats men more fairly than women, they won't rush to sign on the dotted line. Instead, they'll say, maybe in some ways, express agnosticism, flatly disagree, or just shrug. Upshot. You should be a feminist if and only if society generally treats men more fairly than women. So does it? This is a complex, confusing question, but we can credibly answer it. How? The best way to tackle complex, confusing questions, as I've taught you, is to break them into simpler, clearer steps. Here are the steps I propose. Step 1. List the main ways that society appears to treat women less fairly than men, and the main ways that society appears to treat men less fairly than women. Step 2. Weigh the extent to which these fairness gaps are genuine by correcting for gender gaps in actual performance. Step 3. Aggregate all the performance-corrected gaps from Step 2. So let's follow the steps. 1. Listing unfairness. Listing the main ways that society appears to treat women less fairly than men is easy because feminists have been broadcasting their concerns for generations. Topping the list. A. Men make more money than women. B. Men are overrepresented at the top levels of business, government, science, and beyond. C. Men do much less child care and housework than women. D. Non-custodial fathers provide little financial or parental support for their children. E. Men are the perpetrators, and women are the victims of the vast majority of sexual violence. F. Men view women as sex objects. Listing the main ways that society appears to treat men less fairly than women requires only a little more reflection to complete. Note, the single best work here probably remains Farrell, Warren, Women Can't Hear What Men Don't Say, Destroying Myths, Creating Love, 1999. Topping the list. A. Men are overrepresented at the bottom levels of society. They do most of the nasty, dangerous work, are much more likely to be homeless or imprisoned, and much more likely to kill themselves. B. Men spend much more time on the job than women. C. The law heavily favors women in child custody and child support disputes. D. Men are more likely to be victims of violent crime. E. Men are much more likely to die in combat. In fact, during serious military conflicts, they face military slavery, the draft. F. Women view men as success objects. Critics of feminism typically respond to the first list with the second list. Since the key contention is whether society generally treats men more fairly than women, and the two lists are in the same ballpark of unfairness, this is not a bad approach. However, merely countering the first list with the second takes a questionable shortcut. For a quite comprehensive second list that does not take this questionable shortcut, see Bennett or David, The Second Sexism, 2012. To evaluating unfairness. The questionable shortcut is, assuming that if outcomes are unequal, society is unfair, quite crowd-pleasing. Yet, on reflection, there is a world of difference between unfairness and inequality. I have never won an Olympic medal, but I was not treated less fairly than repeat Olympic champions. I have 0 medals due to my own lack of athletic talent and effort, and not because the tournament's rules are somehow stacked against me. The upshot: to assess feminism, we cannot merely list gender inequalities. We have to figure out why these inequalities exist. If this sounds hard, it is. Fortunately, I belong to an intellectual discipline that knows how to handle questions like these. My discipline, as you recall, is economics. Our standard approach to gender disparities is to use statistics to compare the results for men and women with identical non-gender traits. This allows us to see, for example, if women make less money because they are women or because they are less likely to work full-time jobs. When we apply this method to the modern United States, most of the apparent unfairness for both women and men turns out to be grossly overblown. A. The earnings gap. Let's start with the gender earnings gap. Economists have studied it for decades, and I've spent years going over the data myself. Note, the most thoughtful and eloquent analysis, though, is by political scientist Warren Farrell in his Why Men Earn More: The Startling Truth Behind the Pay Gap and What Women Can Do About It. For my own humble contribution, see Caplan, Bryan. The college premium versus the marriage premium, a case of double standards. There's a strong result. If you compare single childless men to single childless women, almost all of the earnings gap goes away. Note, Indeed, even ignoring family status, the estimated male-female gap falls to less than 10% after adjusting for industry and occupation. This has been true for over 3 decades. Blau, Francine, and Kahn, Lawrence, The Gender Wage Gap, Extent, Trends, and Explanations. The overwhelming reason women earn less is that the average man focuses heavily on making money, while the average woman tries to balance making money, caring for her kids, and self-expression. Honestly, though, the statistics are overkill. If it were really true that women were paid, say, 20% less than equally productive men, every business would have a no-brainer get-rich-quick strategy. Fire all your men and replace them with women, cutting labor costs by up to 20%. If this strategy really worked, it would have swept the economy ages ago. Why complain about unfairness when you can become a billionaire by counteracting it? Admittedly, there are a few clever economists who acknowledge all these facts, yet still decry women's unfair pay. How? One popular story blames society for failing to have massive social programs to give mothers easier choices. This is a bizarrely high bar. Total strangers are unfair because they don't want to pay even more taxes to help you raise your own kids. What? Are taxpayers your slaves? Another reaction to the econometric evidence is to blame society for brainwashing women into focusing on childcare at the expense of career success. For as long as I can remember, however, the shoe has been on the other foot. Schools and the media aggressively encourage girls to pursue career success and avoid early pregnancy. They almost never preach the joys of motherhood. Upshot: if women prioritize family over work, they do so despite brainwashing rather than because of it. In any case, this brainwashing story is doubly absurd. First, balancing career success against quality of life is common sense, not an exotic dogma you have to ram down people's throats. Second, if a child blames his behavior on cartoons, we roll our eyes. We should be even more dismissive of those who try to shift the responsibility for people's career and family choices onto society. B. The top and the bottom. Moving on. What about men's overrepresentation at the top and the bottom of society? Many feminists are barely aware that low-status males are alive. Thoughtful feminists, however, blame male failure on male behavior. Far more males are imprisoned because far more males commit crimes. Far more males are homeless because males are far more likely to live lives of idleness and substance abuse. Men do most of the nasty, dangerous work because they value money over job satisfaction. Men do the most physically demanding jobs because they are better at that kind of work. And when thoughtful feminists say such things, they are almost surely right. Once you blame male failure on male behavior, however, you should consider the possibility that male behavior also explains male success. And again, it almost surely does. Men are more likely to pursue careers in science, tech, and politics, and more likely to start their own businesses. This alone accounts for much of the success gap. Similarly, men are more likely to put their careers above their families. Not me, as you know, but I'm an outlier. This unsurprisingly leads to more successful careers, yet chillier relations with their children. Stepping back, men are simply more likely to obsessively focus on success in anything. Thus, even though anyone can edit Wikipedia, about 90% of Wikipedia editors are male. Just 6% of the most prolific editors are female. And while obsessive focus rarely leads to superlative success, lack of obsessive focus predictably prevents superlative success. Sophisticated feminists will concede these obvious facts, then argue that our society is unfair for failing to make girls just as obsessive as boys. Some blame parents for failing to push their daughters as hard as their sons. Others will blame our whole society for failing to inspire women to pursue excellence. If either story is correct, though, why are males also overrepresented at the bottom of society? In any case, this is more bizarre blame shifting. As you know, from a young age I've tried to give you and your brothers ample freedom to live your lives as you think best. I never pressured any of you to pursue superlative achievement at the expense of family and fun. Was this unfair of me? Was it unfair of total strangers to leave us in peace? C. The family. What about housework and child care? Women definitely do the lion's share. However, it is also true that men spend more time doing paid work pay that family men routinely use to support their families. If you look closely at the numbers as I have, you will discover that married men's and married women's average hours of paid plus unpaid toil are almost exactly the same, at least in the modern United States. Admittedly, this average conceals much variation. Working moms do indeed spend more time toiling than working dads. Stay-at-home moms, in sharp contrast, spend markedly less time toiling than working dads. It is worth pointing out as well that a great deal of housework and childcare is discretionary anyway. Moms are their own toughest critics, which is another way of saying that if they spent 10% less time on housework and childcare, the rest of the family probably wouldn't complain or notice. Even if men and women spend equal amounts of time toiling, isn't it unfair that men get to work so much outside the home, while women are stuck home taking care of kids? You could just as easily ask, isn't it unfair that women get to take care of kids, while men are stuck working outside the home? My point, the way people feel about paid work versus childcare varies widely, and the traditional division of labor largely exists by the couple's mutual consent. Moms usually want to be their kids' primary caregiver, and almost never want to work while the dads stay home, and most dads favor the same arrangement. Now, if the traditional division of labor were obligatory, you might object that it is unfair to non-traditional parents of both genders. Happily, it's not. The traditional division is just the leading option. If you want something else, don't lash out at society. Instead, try to preempt a marital mismatch by making your feelings known long in advance of having kids. Some of the angriest claims of unfairness arise when parents split up or never unite in the first place. In such cases, mothers usually provide the lion's share of child care and financial support. Isn't this unfair? Sure, if the father actually committed to helping and then reneged. But what if the father never even offered to contribute or explicitly refused from the outset? At least in the United States, the government still requires an unwilling from the get-go father to pay child support, which seems unfair indeed. A woman can legally choose to abort a child she does not want, but a man cannot legally refuse to fund a child he does not want. What about gender bias in child custody cases? Not too many decades ago, the law officially favored mothers. Unless the court deemed them unfit, women got custody. Nowadays, this blatant bias is mostly gone, yet women are still much more likely to win custody disputes. As usual, though, this inequality is weak evidence of unfairness. The default explanation is that women are, on average, better and more involved parents. Unlike the income gap, admittedly, high-quality research on the custody gap remains scarce, and unlike entrepreneurs, judges can't become billionaires by avoiding discrimination. So perhaps some of the judicial system's earlier de jure bias against fathers survives de facto. Crime and war. Females probably endure a majority of sexual violence, though prison rape makes even that claim disputable. What is quite clear is that males endure a majority of all violence. For murder, the best measured and gravest violent crime, male victims outnumber female victims by a factor of almost 4-to-1 in the United States. Note: reported victimization rates by gender are much more equal for less serious violence. But this could easily reflect our tendency to define violence against women more broadly than violence against men. Crime in the U.S., 2019 FBI. The global ratio is about the same. You could argue that male crime victims are more likely than women to be complicit. One of the best predictors of being a crime victim is, in fact, being a criminal, and men are far more likely to be criminals than women. Still, since most criminals probably don't deserve death, this caveat weakens, but does not reverse the conclusion that most murdered innocents are male. The fairest result, naturally, would be for zero innocents of either gender to suffer. Yet the key issue for feminism is whether innocent women are more likely to be victimized than innocent men. We can't satisfactorily answer this with crime data alone. Once we count organized warfare, though, the correct answer becomes clear. Males are much more likely to die in war than women. The main reason for this is plainly that males are much more likely to fight. In mild conflicts, admittedly, you could emphasize that soldiers are usually volunteers. Even if their cause is just, at least they receive compensation for the risk. In serious conflicts, however, countries routinely resort to military slavery, also known as conscription or the draft. Indeed, many countries have had military slavery during peacetime. And while a few countries enslave both men and women, the overwhelming majority of military slaves have been and continue to be male. In 2022, your brother Simon and I toured Eastern Europe during the Ukrainian refugee crisis. In less than a month, millions of Ukrainians fled their war-torn country. Yet among them, we saw no male refugees between the ages of 18 and 60. Why? Because the Ukrainian government refused men in this age range permission to leave. Even if they're not soldiers, they're legally required to stay behind as human shields in a savage war. Why? Because they were born male. Objectification. Men put great emphasis on women's looks. This is undeniable and seems unfair. Physical attractiveness is only one trait out of many. How can men pay so little attention to women's virtues and personality? Women, similarly, put great emphasis on men's success. This, too, is undeniable, and this, too, seems unfair. Career performance is only one trait out of many. How can women pay so little attention to men's virtues and personalities? The common thread: human beings are superficial. Especially for romantic partners, they tend to fixate on a tiny subset of what matters long-term. Disappointing, but on reflection, it's not as bad as it sounds. Short-term mating is more superficial than long-term mating. Human beings vary widely in their degree of superficiality, and you personally are free to vary as much as you want. Marrying a mere success object is, I warn you, simply foolish. Unless your partner is loyal and fun, you will have a sad life together. You could object that success, unlike looks, often reflects both virtues and personality. Hard work, determination, and ambition are all vital for personal prosperity. Physical attractiveness, in contrast, reveals little beyond itself. So while both men and women are superficial and unfair, men are somewhat more so. This argument might not matter much to someone like you, my daughter, who has both inner and outer beauty. Still, I grant its plausibility. 3. Aggregating unfairness. The main takeaway from the last section is that there is much less gender-based unfairness in our society than meets the eye. In some ways, women have tougher lives than men. In other ways, men have tougher lives than women. On careful examination, however, these unequal outcomes are rarely unfair. Instead, they reflect unequal performance. When men outperform women, they enjoy more success than women. When women outperform men, they enjoy more success than men. The main exceptions: men really are much more likely than women to renege on their promises to help support their children. While could you blame such women for failing to properly screen the fathers of their children for reliability, mistreatment of the gullible is still mistreatment. Furthermore, romantic partners occasionally do evolve in shocking ways. A father who seems totally reliable at the time of a child's conception probably has at least a 10% chance of being a terrible father nonetheless. Sad, but true. At the same time, men really are more likely than women to be the victims of violent crime. This difference may simply reflect greater male criminality, but excess male deaths in serious wars, combined with military slavery, stem almost entirely from colossal unfairness to men, the idea that men are somehow born with a duty to face mortal danger for the sake of total strangers. The somewhat plausible claim that men are even more unfairly superficial than women is minor by comparison. What then is the big picture? The fairness of the treatment that men and women receive in our society is remarkably equal, and if there is a disparity, it is probably in women's favor. This is especially true if we ponder one last gender gap. Men endure far more false accusations of unfairness than women do, and far more intimidation to stay silent or feign agreement in the face of false accusations. How can I say such a thing? Simple. Feminists in our society have the rhetorical high ground. Politicians, teachers, and journalists don't just take it for granted that our society treats men more fairly than women. They speak as if our society treats men like kings and women like dirt. This in turn leads them to habitually vilify men and lash out at anyone who dares to dissent. Happily, these opinion leaders are only an outspoken minority of our society, but they set the tone for public life. Men continue to privately object to feminist dogma with friends, but it takes nerves of steel or jobs of tenure to trumpet your reservations to the world. My point. Suppose that society treats men and women equally fairly, with one exception. Opinion leaders habitually claim that one gender's treatment is vastly worse. This rhetoric would, ipso facto, make society's treatment of the other gender unfair. In a world without feminism, it wouldn't be crazy to argue that society treats men a little more fairly than women. If you add a hyperbolic, prominent feminist movement to that world, however, you have just tipped the scales of fairness the other way. Still, it's tempting to stonewall. Despite all these arguments, feminism just seems true. Honestly, I feel the temptation myself. Here's what I think is afoot. First, contra feminism, human beings take female suffering more seriously than male suffering. Consider the classic lifeboat slogan, women and children first. We expect men to be stoic and chivalrous, to gladly and silently sacrifice for the sake of women. As a result, we fixate on female suffering, even when male suffering is vastly greater. Perhaps the most notorious instance was Hillary Clinton's 1998 statement that women have always been the primary victims of war. Women lose their husbands, their fathers, their sons in combat. Even when the males are literally dying, it remains rhetorically easier to get people to lament the collateral misery of the women who knew the fallen. Feminism succeeds because it is false. Claims about the unfair treatment of women capture our attention because men and women in our society especially abhor the unfair treatment of women. Second, the feminist movement freely deploys intimidation against critics, no matter how mild or unwitting their criticism. Indeed, feminists' standard operating procedure is to make outlandish claims backed by thinly veiled threats to get mad at anyone who calls their bluff. As a result, we hear little public criticism of feminism. Even people who disagree with feminist complaints often bill themselves as defenders of true feminism, trying to invoke this magic word as a shield. All this spawns the illusion that feminism is so intellectually impervious that critics are at a loss for words. The reality is that feminism is so rhetorically dominant that critics fear opening their mouths. 4. Feminism around the world and over time. If you're paying attention, you'll note that when I compare how society treats men and women, I am largely talking about the modern United States, along with other rich, Western, English-speaking countries. If we look at other countries and time periods, we can easily find societies that do blatantly treat men more fairly than women. In such societies, feminism would be true, and if you had the misfortune to live there, you should be a feminist. Though even then, you should definitely not embrace the whole Western feminist intellectual, attitudinal, and behavioral package. Take Saudi Arabia. Until recently, every Saudi woman had a male guardian, typically a father, husband, brother, or uncle who could legally forbid her to work, travel, or marry. Prior to 2019, Saudi women were not legally allowed to drive, even with the permission of their guardians. In this system, you but not your brothers would be treated as a child for life. True, Saudi Arabia also has plenty of gender-neutral tyranny. They really do execute both men and women for blasphemy. Yet the Saudis' overall treatment of women is much worse. In Saudi Arabia, I would be a feminist, though I would probably be too terrified to publicize the fact. While Saudi Arabia is one of the most blatantly anti-female countries in the world, it may be far from the worst. The two most populous countries on Earth, China and India, have strangely imbalanced gender ratios. For every 100 girls, both China and India have about 110 boys. Many observers take this as a sign of widespread female infanticide, though much of the disparity probably stems from selective abortion. Still, if even 10% of these enormous disparities reflect infanticide, millions of female Chinese and Indian babies have been murdered. Note, to be precise, millions more female than male babies have been murdered. Observed Chinese and Indian sex ratios are consistent with high levels of male infanticide, as long as female infanticide is even higher. Note that if sex-based abortion is 10% as unfair as murder, the total unfairness of the abortions would roughly equal the total unfairness of the murders. The case for feminism in such countries would be ironclad. The same principles hold for any historical society, but proceed with caution. All earlier societies have been much poorer than our own. As a result, women used to endure what we would call extreme hardship. And guess what? So did men, before you conclude that earlier societies treated women more unfairly than men. Therefore, you must assess how both genders fared. Don't just dwell on the plight of an American mother who spent 12 hours a day on housework and childcare back in 1900. Instead, compare her plight to her husband's. This won't merely give you a better historical perspective. It will highlight how much of the progress that women have enjoyed since 1900 reflects not feminist ideas, but the rising prosperity of men and women alike. The cleverest objection to my sanguine view of gender in modern Western countries, by the way, is that feminism has become false because of feminism. In this view, American society in 1950 did indeed treat men much more fairly than women. Then the feminist movement arose and raised awareness. The movement didn't just change norms, it inspired governments to ban discrimination, sexual harassment, and much more. Without continued feminist pressure, governments would ease up and the unfairness of earlier times would re-emerge. According to this story, that is why economists detect so little gender discrimination in the labor market. Not that government is unnecessary to protect women, but that government is doing its job to protect women. What's wrong with this story? To repeat, if it were really true that businesses were paying women 20% less than equally qualified men, then every business would have a no-brainer get-rich-quick strategy. Fire all the overpaid men and replace them with women. Laws against discrimination really are like laws against burning money, a witch hunt against an offense that, properly measured, barely exists. Laws against sexual harassment are more complicated. Clearly, government regulation has greatly reduced unwanted on-the-job sexual attention. However, the government has also greatly reduced wanted on-the-job sexual attention. Regulation, heavily inspired by feminism, has created a workplace climate of fear and repression, where co-workers keep their romantic thoughts and feelings to themselves to protect their careers. What was the workplace like before sexual harassment laws? People who remember the old days are growing scarce, but I have debriefed some. Severe on-the-job sexual harassment was never normal, but co-workers engaged in a lot more flirting and dating. When people, usually women, received unwanted attention, they rejected the pursuer, which usually solved the problem. If that didn't work, they complained to the boss, which usually solved the problem. And if that didn't work, perhaps because the pursuer was the boss, the old adage of, if you don't like it here, you can quit was the final recourse. A perfect system? Hardly. But treating adults like wicked children, as today's laws do, is much worse. 5. Lingering questions. See, isn't patriarchy bad for everyone? When I identify society treats men more fairly than women as the core feminist doctrine, a few critics object, no, the core feminist doctrine is that patriarchy is bad for both genders. This raises two questions. First, do we actually live in a patriarchy? Second, assuming we live in a patriarchy, is it really bad for both genders? Defining patriarchy weakly as a society where males are more successful than females in business, science, technology, and politics, we plainly live in a patriarchy. Yet if, as I previously argued, this success gap largely reflects a performance gap, it is hard to see why this is bad for either gender, much less both genders. Why isn't the best system a meritocracy, where the top rewards go to the highest achievers and individuals decide for themselves if the prizes of success are worth the sacrifices? Note: true, you could consider some of these endeavors to be so corrupt that success is actually shameful. This, as you probably know, is my view of politics. You could fall back on the brainwashing complaint society tells men but not women to strive for success, to the detriment of both genders. But to repeat, this story can't explain why men are overrepresented at the bottom as well as the top of society. Defining patriarchy strongly as a society where males are unfairly more successful than females in business, science, technology, and politics, we don't live in a patriarchy. Still, if we did live in patriarchy so defined, the conclusion that both genders suffer would be credible. While some men would gain from their unearned high status, the waste of female talent would impoverish men and women alike. In other words, unfairness to women is worse than it looks, because it automatically leads to economic inefficiency for humanity. This is a reasonable inference. But if society does not in fact treat women more unfairly than men, the point is moot. Doesn't patriarchy cause suicide? The most superficially plausible version of patriarchy is bad for everyone focuses on high male suicide rates. In the United States, for example, men are now about 3 times as likely to kill themselves as women. Doesn't this show that traditional gender norms and male domination drive men to despair? Hardly. Rather, this is a case of feminist dogmatism. Heads they're right, tails they're right. Simple point. If women were the gender with higher suicide rates, feminists would obviously take this as support for their views. How then can the opposite pattern also support their views? If patriarchy really did cause male suicide, we would expect the most traditional societies to have the highest male-female suicide ratio. The opposite is true. Asia and Africa have the lowest male-female suicide ratio. The region with the highest is Europe. Looking at individual countries, the patterns are all over the place. Sweden has a low male-female suicide ratio of 2.1. Iceland's, though, is 5.1. Famously traditional India's ratio is only 1.3 versus 3.3 in the United States. Why then are men so likely to kill themselves? I could just dogmatically blame feminism for making men miserable, but that doesn't fit the facts either. In the United States, male suicide rates today are almost the same as in 1950, when the feminist movement was barely visible. Female suicide rates during the same period rose about 10%. Looking at the whole U.S. series, suicide rates for both genders slowly fell from 1950 to 2000. Then between 2000 and today, suicide rates rose 30% for men and 50% for women. Why did all this happen? I don't know, but blaming patriarchy is just a conspiracy theory that stifles healthy curiosity. See, aren't we getting fairer? Holding performance constant, it seems much easier for motivated, high-ability women to succeed in America today than in 1950. Doesn't this at least show that feminists in 1950 were correct? Only in isolation. The labor market is probably fairer for motivated, high-ability women today, though it is even clearer that modern labor markets contain far more motivated, high-ability women. Yet for most women, past and present, elite jobs were never a live option, and in other major ways modern society treats women less fairly. In 1950, the vast majority of mothers could count on the father of their children for financial and personal support. Optimistically, perhaps 2/3 of mothers could say the same today. Note, only 60% of children are now born to married parents, and about 40% of marriages end in divorce. Some non-marital fathers and more divorced fathers scrupulously support their children, but the overall picture isn't pretty. Dramatic increase in the proportion of births outside of marriage in the United States from 1990 to 2016. Child Trends, Stevenson, Betsy, and Justin Wolfers. Trends in Marital Stability, Research Handbook on the Economics of Family Law, 2011. Again, the best approach is to methodically review and aggregate all the main alleged forms of social unfairness by gender circa 1950. If we did, I suspect we would discover that elite women were treated less fairly in 1950, but average women were treated more fairly. Main complication. In 1950, males would not have faced the feminist climate of false accusations and intimidation that they endure today. So perhaps the standard view that the unfairness gap has moved in women's favor since 1950 is right for the wrong reason. Relative unfairness against women has fallen because absolute unfairness against men has increased. D. What about pressure for gender conformity? Every society has norms about how women are supposed to act and frowns upon women who break these norms. This isn't so bad if you want to conform, but what about all of the non-conformist women? Perhaps we should just think of feminism as the view that every woman should feel free to be herself. The main problem with this picture is that every society also has norms about how men are supposed to act and frowns upon men who break these norms. And the frowning that men face is almost definitely more punitive and unforgiving. Childhood is much harder for the sissy than the tomboy, and this disparity likely continues into adulthood. Note, at my request, famed sex researcher Michael Bailey informally polled a large group of his peers on this point and found strong agreement, though admittedly none could point to any definitive work on the issue. Treating this as a feminist issue is therefore strange at best. Indeed, it's in the same obtuse ballpark as Hillary Clinton's claim that women suffer the most in war, even though men do most of the dying. Yes, you should feel free to be yourself, and so should your brothers. By the way, don't be surprised if feminists try to pressure you into gender non-conformity. While officially they praise a woman's right to choose whatever life she wants for herself, in practice, feminists tend to look down on women who choose traditional gender roles. E. What should you do if your ideas or work are discounted because you're a woman? This is a question from one of my best friends. My answer? To start, never presume that such discounting has anything to do with your gender. Almost every living person feels inadequately appreciated. The simplest explanation is general human egotism. Human beings obsess over their own greatness and neglect the greatness of others. If you're being honest, then you must be mindful of the possibility that you're overrating yourself. Yet even in the worst-case scenario, others are ignoring your manifest greatness because you're a woman. The most constructive response is to A. do even better, and B. be friendly. Trying to intimidate your detractors is emotionally tempting but rarely effective for either gender. Remember, given how egotistical human beings are, getting them to admit their own iniquity is practically hopeless. Instead, make them feel like your success is their success. Easier said than done, yes, but still your best bet. F. How should you market yourself? Many of my friends maintain that feminism is too culturally dominant to openly oppose. Instead of saying, I'm not a feminist, you should say, I'm the right kind of feminist. Perhaps they're correct, but I'm skeptical. Unless you want to be a professional intellectual, the most prudent course is to focus on actions, not words. Don't talk about feminism as a positive or a negative. Instead, do a good job and be friendly. If fanatics impose feminist loyalty tests, change the subject and avoid the testers. If reasonable people want to have a friendly conversation about feminism, politely share your views. Ideally, you'll have tons of friends and the people inclined to be your enemies won't realize you're alive. Granted, this strategy hinders efforts to network with feminists, an influential faction in modern society. But branding yourself as the right kind of feminist would probably alienate this faction even more. The good news? Firmly rejecting feminism will help you network with male co-workers and mentors, who will probably continue to exert greater real-world influence. The key issue? The climate of strident feminism has made potentially helpful men afraid to work with and mentor women. You're just one individual, so you can't expect to personally fix this sad situation. What you can do, however, is market yourself as an exception. I don't bite. Fear me not. I assume the best of others. I'm a can-do person with a good sense of humor. Feminists predictably resent women who use their I am not one of those feminists attitude to bond with male co-workers and mentors. This suggests to me that the I'm not one of those feminists strategy works. Use it. G. How can so many feminists be so wrong? How can an intellectual movement as vast as feminism be so wrong? Simple first, The ideas of feminism are emotionally appealing. The ideas give every angry woman and every guilty man a bearded scapegoat for the imperfection of the world. Second, the community of feminists is socially active. Day after day, the community comforts believers and intimidates unbelievers. If this seems facile, note that the same goes for almost every organized religion. To be blunt, if there are n intellectually incompatible religions on earth, at least n1 must be false. How then do all the false religions survive? By offering emotionally appealing ideas, plus communities that welcome the faithful and decry heretics and infidels. Who are the best feminists? The most intellectually respectable feminists, in my view, are almost all left-leaning labor economists. Note, better yet, though, are staunch critics of feminism like Warren Farrell, who still call themselves feminists. But for me to call them the best feminists is a cop-out because I don't really consider them feminists. Unlike other feminists, they've done the necessary math to grasp that gender success gaps often reflect gender performance gaps. Indeed, most such feminists concede that gender performance gaps now explain almost all gender success gaps. How, then, do they remain feminists? By replacing feminist facts with feminist values. If statistics say that the true gender wage gap is 1/4 as big as most feminists believe, left-leaning labor economists' go-to frame is a disturbingly large wage gap remains, not a disturbingly large exaggeration of the wage gap remains. Similarly, in the face of the inevitable imperfections of empirical work, left-leaning labor economists will announce, "We cannot rule out a significant role for gender discrimination," when they could just as easily declare, "We cannot rule out zero role for gender discrimination," or "We cannot rule out reverse gender discrimination." What's wrong with the best feminists, in short, is that they casually accept the conventional view that women's suffering counts much more than men's and interpret their impressive knowledge through that distorted lens. Ex-feminism and you. Suppose I'm thoroughly right about feminism. Still, Valley, you could fairly ask, Dad, why do you care so much about what I think about this issue? I've written you precisely one essay-length letter. Why was the topic, don't be a feminist instead of don't be a socialist, or don't be a pessimist? And why didn't I write the same letter to your brothers? My answer, out of all the letters I could write to you, this one will do you the most good. And as your father, I am eager to help you. What's so helpful about your father telling you about the flaws of feminism? First, feminism is a life-tarnishing creed for the adherent, because it makes a virtue out of wallowing in antipathy and self-pity. While many self-styled feminists are kind and happy, this is largely because they don't take their doctrine seriously. Earnest feminism reliably leads to dire character flaws. Earnest feminism leads you to treat men unjustly, to reflexively blame them both collectively and individually for the sheer imperfection of life. Earnest feminism leads you to treat non-feminists unjustly, to respond to reasonable objections with condescension and thinly veiled threats. Earnest feminism turns you against your family to see the father and brothers who have always loved and cared for you as part of the enemy. And earnest feminism leads you to treat yourself poorly to see yourself as a victim, whose only reliable allies are other earnest feminists. Second, I predict my words will dramatically change the way you think. Feminism has become so culturally dominant, especially for young women, that you'll probably end up a feminist unless I talk you out of it. Yet, the intellectual case for feminism is so weak that I think one well-crafted letter will talk you out of it. Or at least leave you with healthy skepticism. My daughter, life is already going to give you some indisputable reasons to feel angry and sad. The wise path is to meet adversity with an optimistic and can-do perspective. Remember that bad things are the exception, not the rule, and plan ahead to make these exceptions rarer still. In practice, feminism spurns the wise path. It trains you to see unfairness where none exists, and the main remedy feminism trains you to deploy is the high-risk, low-return strategy of intimidation. Yes, you might terrify others into doing as you wish, but you're more likely to lose friends and alienate people. In any case, as I've taught you, if the only way to win is to treat innocent people like dirt, you should choose to lose. If treating innocent people like dirt sounds like hyperbole, please Google the hashtag not all men. Whatever their flaws, most intellectual movements make an effort to distinguish wrongdoers from bystanders. When conservatives complain about black crime, for example, they usually go out of their way to acknowledge that most blacks are not criminals. Almost all intellectual movements are apologetic if they accidentally conflate bystanders with wrongdoers. If a conservative casually remarks blacks commit so much crime, and a listener responds, "Are you saying that all blacks are criminals?" the conservative will almost certainly rush to reply with a humble, "Of course not." Feminist thinkers, in contrast, routinely and self-righteously do otherwise. When they complain about male unfairness, they almost never go out of their way to acknowledge that most men treat women fairly. And when critics point out that not all men treat women unfairly, feminist thinkers refuse to humbly concede the point. Instead, they treat this request for common decency as another affront against women and respond with a sarcastic hashtag. In fact, feminist thinkers often speak as if there are no innocent bystanders here because failing to devote your life to feminism is itself a grave offense. If this sounds fanatical, it is. I'm perfectly happy to grant that not all feminists are fanatics. Most self-identified feminists are probably just regular people who don't like to see women mistreated. Unfortunately, most vocal feminists are fanatics, and rank-and-file feminists tend to defer to them. If this sounds overly grim, try Googling reactions to this very essay. I predict that almost all of the feminist responses won't just fail to engage my main arguments. They will have a hysterical tone and heap personal abuse on a man they never met because he challenged their worldview. I wouldn't be surprised if they claimed I was a bad father. Wild accusations, despite severe ignorance. That's fanaticism for you. And to belabor the obvious, being a fanatic is awful a pathway to being wrong and doing wrong. One of the best ways to avoid error and injustice is to acknowledge that human beings are prone to error and injustice, and to remember that you're a human being. If someone politely tells you you're wrong, you should listen carefully and calmly. In a word, rationally. If someone angers you, you should strive to treat them carefully and calmly. In a word, justly. Some feminists may dismiss rationality and justice as male virtues, but that's one of the greatest insults to women even uttered. Rationality is not a male virtue. Justice is not a male virtue. They are human virtues, and I trust you will practice them. After all, Valley, you are my daughter. Acknowledgements. Thanks to many anonymous friends who provided detailed and thoughtful comments. In a better world, it'd list all their names. April 20th, 2022.